James Swallow reports all his Nemesis thoughts. Assassins are everywhere. Horrors beware.
Fabulous. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Mirror Manga Grimdark Buddies YouTube channel. I'm joined again by the amazing James Swallow. Hi, James.
Hello, good to have you. Good to have me back on the show. It's really nice to be.
Yes.
Thanks for having me on. I'm really looking forward to talking about Nemesis. It's been quite a while. We were just saying 2009 when I
Yeah.
wrote it. So
And I,
feels
I
like an
was
age.
I was saying that's probably when you were in short pants, a little lad running around. It is the 13th book in the Heresy. Lucky for me. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to catch up a little bit because I'm a bit of a James Swallow stalker. I'm sure that you're fine with that. And yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit before about in the last interview about how you became to be a writer and all these things. What does it feel like being a Sunday Times bestseller, James?
That's pretty cool. You know, Nemesis was my first New York Times best-selling novel. That was I have a great story about that actually. Christian Dunn was my editor at the time on that one, and because you know when the sales figures came in, obviously they get to see them at the editorial before any of the writers do. So he called me up and he's like, "Oh, hey, guess what?" And I said, "What?" And he said the first line of your obituary has just been written.
Whoa.
I was like, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, because you're a New York Times best-selling writer." And he said, "Now," he said if you eventually get hit by a bus, it will begin. New York Times best-selling author James Swallow was run over by a bus today. That's the first line of your obituary. And I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of nice and, you know, kind of creepy sort of way. But
Yeah,
yeah, I mean,
Christian Dunn in a good place to be organising grimdark novels. But
yeah.
when you're hit by a bus, James, well, that is fantastic. And I mean, for me to get to talk to somebody who's a best-selling author is really exciting because I think I love talking to authors because it's a very few people who dedicate their lives to that. And then even fewer people who get their name in these lists. And, you know, wouldn't be wrong to say you've consistently got awards and things going on. Um,
Well, I like to write, right? I like my job. And so, and I'm lucky that I've been able to work in fields and on franchises that are popular.
yeah,
So, you know, as nice as it is to, I mean, I can't take all the credit for that because, you know, I was writing in a very popular series, which a lot of people loved. So as much of that is it's not just down to my writing, it's also down to the whole sort of team. Everybody behind the Horus Heresy made that a success. And I feel
mm,
like I'm just one part of making that book the hit that it was.
yeah. And what happens? I mean, I have no idea. Does someone come to your door with a little award, or do you get to fly to New York, or what kind of things happen when you go on these lists? Oh,
Nothing, nothing happened.
oh,
There's like,
James!
I'm sorry to, I'm sorry to burst your bubble there. You know, you don't get a plaque. You don't get, you know, you don't get an award. You know, I got, like I say, I got a very nice congratulatory there. I think I do remember Lindsay Priestley, who's a lovely lady, who's also one of the editorial team. Lindsay and I both have a love of nice cheese, and she sent me a box of really nice cheeses as a sort of well done from my publisher. But that's not, you know, the New York Times doesn't send you anything like that. You don't get an award. You don't go to a ceremony. It isn't anything like that because the thing about the New York Times list is people sort of go, oh wow, it's such a big deal. But the thing is it changes every week, and what makes a book popular this week might not be popular next week. So it's not just about how many books you sell; it's how many books you sell in that week at that particular time against that particular sort of other books that are coming out. So
Yeah.
if you came out in a week, let's say when the new Stephen King came out, it doesn't matter if you sold 11 billion books, you're not going to be in the top 10 because he's going to be up there.
You're screwed,
Whereas
yeah.
you could sell half that number, quarter of that number in a different week and be in the top five because the other
Mm,
books haven't sold as much. So it is, you know, it's a very sort of relative kind of thing. So I try to stay kind of humble about it. And when I've talked to other writers who go, "Oh wow, it's such a big deal. I'd love to have that." So it is nice, and it is nice to have that on the cover of my books, and it does help me sell books.
mm,
People think, "Oh, if you're a New York Times bestseller, you've got to be good," but at the same time, it doesn't have a sort of material kind of quality to it.
Mm.
It reminds me of something I actually heard Angelina Jolie say when she was talking about winning an Oscar, and someone said to her, "Oh, Angelina, now you've won an Oscar, you know your career must be on a different level." And she said, "Not really." She said, "The only difference is that in a meeting, sometimes people will take you a bit more seriously." And I think that's definitely true with these kind of things. Is you don't get showered with glory, but people will maybe pay a bit more attention to
Yeah.
what you are and what you're presenting because you've got an award, because you've got an accolade of that kind.
Thank you, James. I do think it's so revealing. Thank you for talking about it because most of us will never know. And thank you for bringing Angela Jolie to my podcast. I love that so much. Bring a bit of glamour. And you've also had Sunday Times bestseller.
Yeah,
Is
that's right.
there a different feeling because that is, UK and Sunday Times is kind of like, ooh, la di da, or is it?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Sunday Times bestseller that was for my Mark Dane novels.
Yeah.
That was kind of nice because yeah, it's like well, this is my home turf, So
Yeah.
seeing a British newspaper doing that, and again, the Sunday Times that carries a different sort of cachet to it.
Mm,
I think, like you say, it is a bit la di da, and it is kind of seen to be sort of like, well, you're a proper writer now if you're in the Sunday Times.
yeah.
So yeah, that's really nice, and I do like being able to sort of have that on my resume, as it does
Yeah.
look nice. It feels like a kind of badge of honor that I can wear. But at the same time, like I say, at the end of the day, it doesn't really materially change anything about the work. It just maybe might will open a few more doors for you that might
Mhm.
not have been open previously.
Well, thank you. I do think people come to see how the Black Library authors get it done, and there's so many facets to the Black Library authors. I can't just talk to them about the one book because I quite often talk to like basically author journeymen. That is their existence. And continuing my stalking, you got to revisit some Judge Dredd and drop
Well,
back into that.
yeah, just recently. That was yeah, it was this year's been the 20th anniversary of my first Judge Dredd novel, Eclipse. Um,
2004, which you must have written when you were 12.
Yeah, that was good fun. That was I'd done a couple of Judge Dredd audio dramas before that, and the wonderful Mark Gascoigne, who's been one of my best editors on a lot of different projects I worked for. Mark was working for Black Flame, which at that time was an imprint of Black Library doing non-games workshop-y stuff. And they had the rights to do 2000 AD characters from Rebellion, and they had the rights to do some stuff from New Line Cinema, things based on like Final Destination and the Twilight Zone, Freddy versus Jason, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And Mark said to me, well, you've got a handle on doing Dread stuff because you did the audios. Do you want to do a Dread novel? And I was like, oh, yeah, absolutely. Because I was a big fan of that comic. I grew up with 2000 AD with Judge Dredd as a character. And the opportunity to sort of get my hands on that and write a full length sort of prose novel, that was terrific, and going back to the book, recently and just sort of thumbing through it, I thought, man, I didn't leave anything on the table there. I put in through everything kitchen sink into this, and I was obviously having an absolute blast writing it. And it's really nice too because that series has been out for a while. Then Black Flame lost the license, and that publisher didn't exist for a while, and those books just sort of disappeared. And I thought, oh well, it's a shame. No one's ever going to get to read that. But because they're owned by Rebellion, which is the parent company of 2000 AD, all the rights reverted back to them. And in, I think, like 2 or 3 years ago, Rebellion said, we're just going to bring all of those books out again, including the previous series of Judge Dredd novels, which has been done by Virgin Publishing in the 90s. And those are all now available as ebooks. So it's great because it means that people can still enjoy them, 20
Yeah.
odd years later.
I mean, I love that because I think so many people really have that kind of symbiosis of Judge Dredd and 80s Warhammer. That is a build-up of their child DNA. But you are a true nerd because you were off at a 1999 convention.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, I love this so much. My dad loved 1999. So and as you know, I love you because you've written for Star Trek. I love you for Black Library. So, what was that like going to a 1999 convention?
Well, that's a show that really comes right back to sort of my nerdish kid roots. So you know, that was airing sort of 1971, 1972. Being out on Saturday mornings on LWT,
Da, 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 da.
watching Space 1999 with my little dinky toy. You know,
Yeah.
that was a very formative experience for me watching that. And then so again, all these years later, having the opportunity to kind of come back and work on something like that, and the show's in its coming up to its 50th anniversary now.
Crikey, we're so old.
But it was really great for me to sort of be able to. I thought I'm never going to be able to write for these characters. I love this fictional universe, but you know, it's not going to be popular anymore. It's not going to come back on. I'm probably never going to get the chance. And then out of the blue, after just having some conversations with Jamie Anderson, who's Jerry Anderson's son, Jamie said to me, "Well, you know, if you could do anything in a Jerry Anderson story, what would you do?" And I said, "Well, I loved Space 1999, you know." And I thought no more of it. And then he came to me this year and he said, "Look, we're going to do some new material for this anniversary. Do you want to write this novella for us?" And I was, you know, absolutely. But again, you know, getting to sort of go back to these things I've loved in my youth and in my younger fandom years, you know, getting to kind of come back and kind of almost, I feel like I'm giving back, contributing a little bit to a world that gave me personally a lot of enjoyment when I was younger, and now I'm sort of adding a little bit to the sort of that sort of crazy quilt of that world, along with all the other writers, and that was a lot of fun. And so, and this weekend was this weekend, not this weekend gone, but just recently, the London 1999 convention, with a bunch of the surviving actors and people bringing props and costumes, and you know, just sort of like talking about how great this TV show was, and it was really fun to be a part of that.
Oh, and when you go,
Nice
oh,
with
sorry.
fans who are just interested in a thing, and just sit down and talk about, like, you know, wow, I love that thing. Don't you love that thing? Yeah, you know, just really just getting into the enjoyment of it. It was really cool.
And when you go to a very specific convention for that, do people have any idea of like the realms that you have written in, or are they just like really fixated on that one thing?
It's a bit of both, really. Is often it'll be people who are just like they're hyper focused on their one particular fandom.
Yeah.
They don't care about whether I wrote a spy thriller or Warhammer or Star Trek. And they're like, no, we care about this thing. We want to know about this thing. But then there are other people who will come to me and say, like, you know, I know you from this other fandom, or I've read the thing that you did for this fandom, and it's intrigued me enough that I've read other stuff that you've done. And that's always really rewarding as well. It really means a lot to me when people come from a different stream of my writing and say, well, I trust you enough that I'll follow you to another franchise. And I'd say, well, you know, if you like what I do here, I apply the same skills to this other thing. So hopefully you'll find that as much fun as the other thing.
Yeah. Well, that's why I know I'll probably get in trouble with some viewers, but I wanted to take a little time out of Nemesis, because when you have a James Swallow, it's important to reveal all the stuff that you're doing, because there will be loads of fans who will be picking up on the various things. And yeah, you are great at the old spy thriller, which is a craft in its own right. And I think, you know, in popular culture at the moment, we're in October 2024, and everybody's watching Slow Horses, and you know, and we are looking at Nemesis, which is very sneaky, dodgy goings on, and you know, setting assassins out there in the universe. One of the things I'll say about this Horace novel is, I mean, I read a lot. I wouldn't say I'm like a super intelligent person. I had to make a lot of notes reading through this because there was so much going on, so many characters and skullduggery, and I was trying to beat you and figure stuff out beforehand. Absolutely no freaking chance. There is a certain craftsman, you know, and I think also I was recently talking to Chris Ray about Bloodlines, which was a very particular noir detective. So not only do you have to write all the IP, know the different types of like goodies and baddies and legions, but you also have to be able to craft this mystery and, you know, skullduggery within different teams. How would you say that you wrote that back then? And then just noting your output, which is lots and lots of skullduggery and spy service, how has that developed as an author?
Well, I mean, in the back of my head, back in sort of like was 2009 when I was writing Nemesis, I still had that idea that, oh, one day I'd like to write a spy novel.
Yeah.
So the desire to do that was sort of, it was at that point, it's still like 4 or 5 years away from me actually doing it, but the desire was definitely there. And I think you can see that poking through into Nemesis is me sort of going, well, maybe I'm kind of, almost like kind of stretching my legs a little bit into the spy thriller, crime thriller world, seeing can I tell this kind of story? Can I do this kind of narrative, but in the Warhammer universe?
Mm.
A lot of it came from me just wanting to do something a little bit different.
Yeah.
Because at that point, we're 13 books into the heresy, and it's pretty much wall to wall Space Marines.
Yeah.
And so we were, one of the key things was like, well, could we do a story that, has hardly any Space Marines in it at all? I mean, even at one point we were saying we won't have any Space Marine characters turn up in the story. And in the end, we kind of couldn't really make that work.
Yeah.
We started going back to kind of the sort of the core concepts of it, because there was something that we would talk about in the heresy meeting.
Mm.
We would get
This is
together.
still the Lords of Terror, like still
Yeah,
getting
the
together
Lords of
in
Terror.
person.
So we would be talking about like, here's the next novel that we were doing. And one of the things that would come up was this idea. We had this kind of idea of like the theoretical, hypothetical imperial citizen, a regular person. We called him Joe Hive City. It's like, if you're Joe Hive City, what is your life like when you're
Yeah.
living the Horus Heresy? Because most of the heresy is these huge battles happening, and it's taking place at a very, very high level, the very sort of epic level with the epic level characters. But what's it like for people like you and me, just regular people, when you have to go down to the shop to buy a pint of milk,
Yeah.
and the Horus Heresy is happening in the distance? It's like, how does that affect your life? And I thought that's a kind of interesting idea, but how do we reflect that? Because the problem is we're writing about these mythic level epic superheroes. Regular people just kind of get trampled on by them for good reason or bad. It's regular people don't really sort of register on that sort of scale. So in the back of my mind, I was thinking it would be nice to find a way to tell a story that has regular people in it, not even soldiers, just literally civilians. Your Joe and Jane Hive City in their home, going to work, doing what they do, but the
Yeah.
Horus Heresy is happening. Is how did that affect them? So that was one of the ideas that was floating around.
Yeah. I
But you
mean,
mentioned that's out there in the ether while we're sort of thinking about these concepts.
yeah. I mean, I definitely, when I read your books, there is such a strong strength to your natural tendency for spying, skullduggery, tricking, twisting. I wouldn't trust you. If you went out of my shopping, James, I'd say precisely what I'd wanted, and I would know the change when I send you out for a pint of milk. But I just really wanted to give a shout out for that, because I think that's a really enjoyable thing about your work. It's basically your like expert crafting of spy stuff. So often this channel turns into me just, shouting out praise and fangirling. So there's some of that out of the way. And I really loved the concept of this book. I do struggle a bit sometimes when it goes, all Bolter Pawnee and, Space Marines. And I was absolutely intrigued. The feeling at the beginning of this book, so we've gone through quite a lot. We've had all the scars and the tearing, and someone's head's been chopped off, and it's very clear that things are going very badly wrong. But this is kind of like the first realization of, we're now in a civil war, we need to sort this out. And the whole conceit of, we could send our best assassins to go and take Horus down, that was a little bit of a moment for me. I was like, okay, this is it now, we're heresying, we're in the thick of it. Did you feel, I mean, obviously this is coming from discussion with your editors and other writers, did you feel like a responsibility to bring it in? And how much of a free rein did they give you? You mentioned you kind of all decided you needed to bring these Space Marine characters in, but were you allowed to say, I really want to do a book on assassins? Or
Well, it came from a lot of different sort of elements, really, that all sort of coalesced at the same time. It's a few years earlier, I talked to Lindsay Priestley about doing a 40K Assassins book.
Hmm.
we were talking about the four main assassin sort of the clades, the sort of the four main assassin houses. And we had this idea, and the original idea was going to be it was going to be one book, but four sort of novellas that would all take place in the same city on the same night, and they would tell the story of four different assassins who are like there on this planet as it's falling to chaos, and these assassins have been sent to kill different people. And what would happen is the stories would cross over one another. So you might have like you have like one assassin sneaking in to stab a guy, and he looks out the window and he sees on the other side of the city a building explodes.
Yeah.
And then the other story would be that building, why that building blew up, and all those kind of things. And it was a really cool idea, and we didn't do it because it turned out to be massively complicated.
Yeah.
Couldn't figure out a way to
Wow.
work, because it was this story crossing over story. And in the end, we were like, this is just not going to work. But it's a compelling idea. The
Yeah.
idea of this assassin team going out to do a mission. So that was sort of floating around out there. We've got the kind of the story about the regular people floating around, and then it all came together in this meeting that I had, and it was basically the meeting was for Graham McNeil and Dan Abnett to talk about Prospero Burns and A Thousand Suns as they were working out, because those two books, what they were working them in to sort of make sure these two books work together. And the editorial said to me, well, Jim, why don't you come along as well? Because, even though you're not writing one of these books, it would be useful to have another voice in the room who's not one of those writers, just as like an outside viewpoint.
Yeah.
So I came along to the meeting, and I felt like a bit of a spare wheel because I didn't really have a lot to contribute. Dan and Graham had pretty much nailed this stuff down. And I threw in a couple of ideas here or there. But generally, I was just kind of there to sort of, just kind of watch that things didn't go too crazy.
Good luck with those two.
Yeah. But it's not like they needed me to sort of like referee them. They knew exactly what they were doing. But in the course of the conversation, we started talking about stuff about other factions in the heresy, and we were like, what are at this point in the Horus Heresy, we were like, well, what's this faction doing? What are the Mechanicum doing during this situation? What are the Custodian Guard doing during this situation? And then someone said, well, what are the Assassinorum doing? Because we haven't talked about that. And then I just heard that. I heard Assassinorum, and suddenly this idea just landed in my head fully formed for this book. And I thought, what about if they send an assassin team to kill Horus? And it's like, okay. And so I started jotting it down. And so there's Dan and Graham talking about their books, and I wasn't even listening. I'm just like writing down. And at the end of the day, when the conversation was all finished, everything was working out, we were packing up our gear to go. Graham comes over to me and he says, so that Assassins thing, you going to write that? And I was like, well, I'm not really sure. He said, well, it's a really good idea, because if you don't do it, I'm going to do it. I was like, but you're already doing this. You can't have this. No, this is mine. It's my idea. So I went away and I just wrote down this idea about the sort of gathering of this sort of caper movie type story, gathering together these assassins and then merging it with this sort of murder mystery story taking place. I pitched that and I said, here's the idea, and it's deliberately designed to be, this is not a Space Marine story. This is going to show you a completely different part of the Horus Heresy, how it affects regular ordinary people, how it affects people who are just trying to live their lives under the shadow of this terrible galactic civil war. And also we'll get some cool assassin stuff and some weird sort of gribbly chaos things going on there. And so that was the pitch. And I think I think editorial liked it because it was just a bit different.
Yeah.
And as you said, we were 13 books in at this point. And I think the sense was, well, maybe we could do this as almost as a way to kind of take a breath between Space Marine battles and Baltimore. Let's do something that's just a little bit different, just to prove that we can, that the heresy isn't just wall-to-wall Space Marine.
I mean, there's nothing like urging on the muse when you got Graham McNeil going, if you don't do this, I'll do it. I bet that pitch was done in a second.
Yeah.
But I will come back to the weird gribbly chaos, which is such a lovely way to describe such debauched horror and body horror. You know how hard it is for me to get. James, I'll read it for you, but I feel this is another area in which you've excelled, your horror writing. And I really, really enjoyed the first half, which was a little bit Ocean's 11, assembling the assassin force. And I also really loved, we got a classic noir detective, Yosef, kind of a planetary plod, just looking after his own pat. How for you did you manage to kind of insert this? Because there's still grandiose stuff going on, you've still got, and some quite big characters coming in as well, which we'll talk about. So what was your inspiration for, like, your PDF plot and your, and the other group I loved, the cultists, who just seemed really pure and were like, just let us pray to our book of blood. How do you get the little people in it and insert them along these things? What's the mindset? Do you try and keep them deliberately ignorant, or yeah, how do you cope with all of that?
Well, I mean, the whole sort of like the whole planet side sort of crime thriller murder mystery sort of thing. That's almost a whole book in itself.
It's almost like two books, three
Yeah,
actually, but
and I
yeah.
deliberately wanted to do that. So what you have is you have these two different storylines that at the beginning they feel like, well, how are these things going to connect? And it's only as the story continues, is slowly but surely, we peel back the reveal, and there's this one thing going on to do with the rogue trader's warrant, and it's like something that you at the beginning of the story is just a bit of a throwaway, and you don't even realize how massively important this one document is towards this huge plot that's like basically two sets of assassins who are going to cross over each other in the middle of the story. So I wanted to just play around with that. I wanted to play with the idea of, like, going back to again what I said, how is it to live a regular person's regular life
Hmm.
on a planet during the Horus Heresy, just trying to get on with your life, and hearing all these stories about, well, there's a war on, oh, well, it's not affecting me. And then people start talking about, it's not just a war, it's weird stuff is going on,
Yeah.
and, strange sort of like chaosy horror stuff is happening. And people are like, well, that can't be real. Surely that sort of thing isn't happening. And that sort of, that dark shadow of this war, every time you turn around and look, it's getting closer and closer and closer. that
Yeah.
sort of that sort of sense of fatalism. One of the things that's interesting about the Horus Heresy is we're seeing the Imperium at a point when it was almost good, when
Yeah.
it was bright and shiny and they had a great future ahead of them. And then the great tragedy of the heresy is that all of that goes away and it becomes this horrific sort of stagnant wasteland that we see in the
Mhm.
40K universe. And I wanted to show a little bit of that. And it's
Yeah.
almost in Nemesis, certainly for the planet of Ayesta Veracruz, is that's the turning point for them. Is that they're everything they love is about to be taken from them.
Mm.
Their world is going to be run, steamrollered by chaos, and they don't know it's going to happen. So that tragedy is coming in, and I thought that's fun to put people in that sort of world and say, what would it be like to experience that? And you've got this cop show story. You've got this serial killer guy hunting a serial killer.
Oh my
uh,
God.
and this is why police characters are always a really fun sort of thing to write, because they're like it's why you get so many cop shows and so many doctor shows, right? Because they're characters who can connect with any sort of walk of life. So if you're a policeman or a doctor, one day you might be looking after someone who's just a poor person. The next day,
Mm.
your job might be to sort of go and see the richest man in the land who's been
Mm.
robbed. And all the strata of sort of society is open to somebody who's a copper or a doctor. And that's why they're great characters, because they have access to the whole of society and they can talk to anybody and they can go and investigate issues and problems. And that's why having a police officer character in this story gives me a chance to show you all the different elements of that society and how those people are reacting to the oncoming Horus Heresy.
Yeah. The oncoming demise of everything they've known and loved.
Yeah.
But I mean, I really, I mean, serial killer. I mean, there's a lot going on, and then when he comes into the mix, like this, I joke with my friend Ian. There's sometimes in books when I'm just reading the book, and if I'm in bed, I'll throw it away, or if I'm reading it sitting down, I'll stand up. And it's just the repeated addition of thing after thing, and it's kind of like, I think if you were looking at like a little ECG of my brain, you'd see these explosions going, and then this happened, and then that happened. Um, do you have like a joy, like when you're writing? Do you have euphoric moments when you make stuff mesh, or are you like, oh, thank God that's worked out? Like, how does it feel?
it's a bit of both, really. You know, there are times when sometimes when you're writing stuff, the bad days are when stuff doesn't marry up, and
Yeah,
it's
I
like this
bet.
in pipes, and you go, "Oh, these pipes don't. They're an inch too short. It's how do I fix that, narratively speaking?" And you might have to dismantle it and then rebuild it again. But when it all comes together, yeah, I love it when a plan comes together, right? That always works really nicely. The
Yes.
best moment is when something comes together that you didn't plan it.
And you're
And
like,
I'm
yes.
so clever. You think I'm so clever. I thought of this without even realizing I thought of it. I'm so
Oh,
good at my job. That's the sort of magic moment.
oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm noticing you're descending into darkness.
Yeah, just give me a second. I'm going to put some lights on in here,
I
actually.
mean, it is the heresy is overtaking one of us.
Let me just pause for one moment.
Resumed. It's funny you should say you love it when a plan comes together because Ian and I were comparing the Guarantine a bit to B.A. Baracus from the 80s. And there's a lovely bit I mean, you know that I devastate these books. I turn all the pages down. I have a special pink highlighter pen, which I can't find at the moment, but there's a bit where the Guarantine's going, my kill, my kill, my kill, my kill. And it's just I think the Guarantine's one of my favorite characters. Um, and yeah, I really loved there were so many different moving parts and how they all kind of like hinked in together. And the drop of Emperor's blood on the Warren. I mean,
Mm.
I am an Emperor botherer, and you know, in my head, I have really I get a lot of stick for liking the Emperor. But you know, I love the conceit that you know there was some existing blood and it was powerful and it proved he is a magical being. Um, so, do you have to? I mean, I think we've spoken about this, but it sounds like they were just trusting you to kind of because when you drop like bits of legacy in there, it kind of becomes canon. So, were you like, by the way, everybody, there's going to be an existing blood of the Emperor, and this will be a thing, and they're like, yeah, that's fine. You do what you think's best, Swallow. Or how does that go?
A lot of that stuff tends to be, you know, there'll be elements or things that are similar to that that are already existing out there in the lore floating around. There's
Mm.
stuff in there, that particular idea about the warrant with the drop of Emperor's blood. That's not my idea. That was actually I read that in it was one of Matt Farah's Shira Calpurnia novels, if you know that,
Ooh, I
which is
don't, but now you're going to have to make me read another book, which
and
happens
they're
every
really
time.
good. Well, I've got to say, Matt's Calpurnia books are fantastic. They're again, if you like police procedural stories, it's about an officer in the Arbites who's like in the 40K universe. Uh,
Yeah.
there's a scene in one of the books where she deals with this rogue trader, and right at the very end of the book, she says, like, you know, the guy's got the warrant of, you know, his warrant of rogue traderness, I can't remember what they call him, the warrant of mark from the emperor
Mm.
that's been sort of like in existence for centuries, you know, thousands and thousands of years. Um, and she asks at the end, after solving this crime, she's like, can I go and see it? Can I look at this incredibly rare artifact that has literally been touched by the emperor? And one of the last scenes is she just kind of goes into the room and is like transcendently moved by
Oh,
being in the room with this object. And as she's looking at it, she looks down and there's this little drop of blood, like in the parchment that's been there. You know, this thing's held in like a stasis field. And I thought it's a fantastic scene. It's a really great idea. And I thought, oh yeah, that would, you know, those things would be out there. And so that idea's in the back of my head somewhere. And
yeah.
when I was coming up with the idea of Sphere, the Black Pariah being this, his sort of psychic superpower is that if he can ingest a genetic marker from somebody, he assimilates that genetic marker and basically becomes the anti-pariah, the anti-energy to whoever that blood belonged to. So if you logically extrapolate that, it's like, well, would that work with the emperor? Could he become like the perfect anti sort of like the perfect sort of poison to the emperor's psyche? And so that's what Chaos's grand plan is
Yeah.
can we get a sample of the emperor's blood and ingest it with this guy and then send this guy after the emperor? And that's what their plan is. And of course, where can you get this blood? Well, you can't just find it anywhere. But it's like, oh, but there's a drop of this blood on this warrant. Can we get to this warrant? So it's this whole grand, complicated scheme to get this guy close enough to this object to prepare himself to directly attack the emperor. And it's only as we've just spoiled the whole ending of it now, right? But that's
okay.
how the story, that's the villain's grand plan through the course of the story that's gradually revealed little by little, all sort of like orbiting around this idea of this one particular document, which, as I say, was this fantastic idea that Matt sort of wrote about in his book. And I thought, well, that dovetailed perfectly with the storyline that I was putting together, and it just connects up really well. That's one of the great things about working in a franchise where there's a lot of lore written by a lot of really talented people, is there's so many cool ideas floating around out there. Sometimes you can just like reach out, pick them up, and just connect a couple together, and it's like, oh, now you've built a completely new storyline out of these bits of sort of narrative Lego that are just floating around out there.
But I have to say, I mean, I've read a lot of different IP books. I've read loads and loads of Doctor Who books. Like, any franchise, I've kind of read a lot of books. I think it speaks volumes to the quality or just the fanboys and fangirls that Black Library pick, because most of them are incredibly informed about so many other books, and Black Library have published a lot of books. I don't think that kind of research or passion for all the material is as evident in many other IPs. So I think that's absolutely beautiful. The added value that you're appreciating another author brings by bringing that idea across. And then the symmetry of one side planning and plotting to take down, Horus with just individuals, and the other side plotting to take down the emperor with a super individual, the Black Pariah. I love that symmetry in storytelling. I just think, again, it's that structure and somebody. Sorry, there really should just be a video of me like just saying all the good things, because otherwise you're just sat there nodding. So I'm sorry if it makes you uncomfortable.
That's lovely. I mean, it's always nice to hear people when we have a conversation like this, when people get into the weeds a bit and dig into the minutiae of it. When you're writing this stuff, you think, well, I hope people get it. And sometimes you'll read a review and go, oh, you didn't get it. You didn't get what I'm trying to say. So it's always nice. It's really rewarding when someone gets it. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and you'll see from the comments, James, people will get it way more deeply and be super excited that you're validating. I knew it was this and that, so that's really, really lovely. Gosh, I've got so many questions, and going into this book, as an emotional reader, I knew that when we were setting up these assassins, when we were looking at all the kind of goody characters, which to me is people who are trying to tell Horus to stop being horrible to the emperor, I knew I had to prepare myself. I knew that they weren't going to succeed and Horus would live. And I knew that they were going to be thwarted. But throughout the book, there were moments when it seemed as though, especially when there's this fantastic twist where a sniper's got a clear shot on Horus and it's been prepared to the minutiae, and he takes the shot, and they've managed to switch Horus out. But you're really thinking, flipping heck, how is this going to, how is he going to be saved? How do you keep up the tension? Because, I suppose the whole way through the heresy, we know what happens at the end, but you still manage to make it really exciting. Like, is there an art to doing that?
This is the big problem that the heresy had from book one, day one, word one. Everybody knows how it plays out. It's like Titanic, right? The ship sinks.
Yeah.
So that's not going to change. So what do you do? Like, if you are using Titanic as an example, right? If the main story is that the ship sinks, well, you tell a story about the people on the ship. And that's what Titanic is a story of Rose and Jack and how their life, they have this one beautiful moment, and then it goes into a terrible, tragic ending. And that's the same thing with the Horus Heresy. We know how it's going to end. We know it's going to end up with, Sanguinius dying and the Emperor on the throne and fighting Horus and all that stuff. And we know about all these different elements of the story that have been set in stone before we started writing the books. So, going in at book 13, I'm not going to kill Horus at the end of that novel. Because that's not the end of the story. And I've had people say to me, well, then why should I bother reading it if I know the end, if I already know the ending? But my argument with that is that's not the ending of the story. The fact that Horus doesn't get killed, or neither does the Emperor, that's not the point of that novel. The point of that novel is not that they were going to kill him, but they came this close.
Yeah.
That's what the story is about. It's about how those characters react to that situation, is how close it was that the entire heresy could have been changed if just one thing had been different and one thing had gone the other way. Horus is when it's poor old Luke Sederer is the one who takes the bullet in the head in
Mm.
Horus's stead. And if you look, at the very beginning, Luke's there at the very beginning, the very first part of the story when an assassin is a poisoner is sent to kill Horus, and
Yes.
gets within sort of 10 feet of his tent and then is killed. And that's kind of like that's the sort of initiating action for the story. Is Erebus is there, and Erebus goes, if they keep sending assassins to us, maybe we should send assassins to them.
Yeah.
So the failure of that guy is what leads the leaders of the Sassanorum to going, look, if we keep sending one guy at a time, it's just not going to work. So we need a new plan. It's like, why don't we send a team? And that's the
Yeah.
sort of initiation of their thing. But Horus's reaction to Luke is that people have said to me, why is it him who takes Horus's place? And I say, yeah, why indeed? It's like, maybe Horus kind of, maybe it's Horus or maybe it was Erebus decided, I want to get that guy out of the way, and this is a good way to do it. Plans within plans, wheels within wheels. All of these
Yeah.
different things have all got like machinations happening. They're all playing parts, little cogs in the larger sort of machine of what the heresy is. And we
Yeah.
see a snapshot of one particular set of battles threading its way through the middle act of the heresy.
Mm.
Even though ultimately the actions of both sides don't succeed, what they do is for us as readers, the people who are kind of participating in the storyline, it shows us a larger part of that world. It's kind of unfolding the heresy and saying all of this was going on. This is how close it came. This close.
Mm.
It's like people talk about, say, like, we often would talk about the Second World War as a model. We say, like, okay, well, if we've talked about this part of the history, we talk about like this is the invasion of Poland, or this is
Mm.
the bomb on Hiroshima, or this is sort of like, this is the Blitz, right? We would often use elements of the Second World War as touchstones.
Yeah.
And I said with this story, it's kind of like the story about the attempted assassination of Adolf Hitler. Is that never happened? But the
Yeah.
story is really interesting about how close, people came to changing the course of the history that we know.
Yeah.
That's at the heart of that story. That's at the heart of Nemesis, because it's talking about, that's where the name comes from. Is like in Greek mythology, Nemesis is essentially, she's the goddess of revenge,
Oh.
the sort of
Oh.
goddess of payback, and
Wow.
and that's so like, even that's kind of a subtle allusion to like that's what this is a story about. This is about revenge. This is about wanting to sort of like get your own back on people. It's not about high ideals of noble conflict. It's about like, I want you dead. And
Yeah.
that's what's driving both sides in this particular story. It's a very human, very negative, very dark emotion, but it's an understandable one. I think anybody could get their head around.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate. I'm kind of like a bit of a dope because I remember even Galaxy in Flames and all of those early books. I was like, but Horace could just say sorry, or one of the brothers could be nice to each other, even knowing it's not working out. The authors can kind of lift you to a place of like, and I mean, I found that tension throughout because I was wondering how people were going to get out of situations or get into them, and I think it was really great your choice of Luke to be the decoy because it was so unexpected. Firstly, there was a shock of have they got Horace, and then it's the shock of finding out who they did get. So I thought it was like a double whammy. So that was fabulous. And let's talk about Spear a bit. So I feel at the end I felt sorry for Spear because if you get wound up with Erebus, I mean, you're not going to have a lovely life and get to go to a private boarding school, let's face it. But he was terrifying. And, I've seen all the shenanigans at the end of Fulgrim, for instance, and I found Spear even horribler than that. I've got a couple of just some samples of your writing to read at you. Uh, the bare arms distended and grew large, their proportions ballooning. Fingers merged into flat mittens of meat, grew stiff and glassy. Hands became bone blades, pennants of pinkish black nerve tissue dangling from them. Hissos aimed the gun and fired at the place where a man's heart would have been, but down came the arms and the shot was deflected away. He smelled a slaughterhouse stink coming off the creature, saw the sizzling pit in the limb from the impact as it filled with ooze and knit itself shut. The body of the thing was in chaos. It writhed and throbbed and pulsed in disgusting ways, and the operative was struck by the conviction that something was inside the meat of it, trying to get out. As the eyeless face glared into him, the distended jaws opening wide to let droplets of spittle fall free, Hissus found his voice. You killed them all. And it's just so horrible. And then there's another example as well. Just, a death scene kind of thing. Wicked talons punctured the vanished torso and tore through dermal flex armor and meat, down into bone and organs. Then the hands split apart and ripped Tariel's ribcage open, emptying him onto the wet stones. I mean, will you help me write my wedding vows, James?
I've forgotten I did that, yeah, where he just sticks his hand and just goes and just rips him apart, yeah.
I mean, I can't ever unsee that, and it's in my imagination, and you've put it there. So let's talk about how a modest young boy grows up to learn. Did you do some research in an abattoir? Should I be worrying about an invitation to come out and hang out with you? That and again, the emotional impact of that. Is it like, oh, phew, I've got that written? Are you grossed out as you're reading it, or does it make you giggle as you're imagining others being grossed out?
I mean, with those sort of things, yeah, my intention is absolutely to create the reaction that you just had.
Okay.
Because in my conception of this character it is a literal horror.
Yes.
And I'm thinking I want to create something that's scary and frightening, and so I think to myself, like, well, what do I find scary? And I mean, one of the touchstones I originally went back to was the first Alien movie. You see that sort of biomechanical horror in the very first Alien movie. It's just one creature, but it's this horrible, spiny, glistening thing, and it just seems to sort of grow and grow, and all these bits kind of coming out of it. And that was, watching that as a kid, that was a very formative horror movie experience for me, because it was alien with a capital A. It's like something you'd never seen before. So when I was writing Spear, I was definitely drawing from that sort of sense of, let's create something that is just so inhuman that it's almost, you can almost not kind of get your head around what's going on. That's what's happening in that scene with Hissos, where he's just like, I don't even know what this is.
Yeah.
I don't have a word for this. All I know is good God, this thing is terrifying, and it's going to kill everybody in the room if I don't stop it.
Yeah.
And so that was trying to create that sort of sensation in the reader. I want the reader to feel that, to be in that guy's headspace, to be confronted by something that's completely outside of your experience, that has that sort of horribleness to it. And there's a telling line in there as well where it talks about the chaos inside the creature.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
wanted to try and embody what is the nature of chaos in the Warhammer universe, is the idea of this sort of turbulent, sort of monstrous sort of system of energy and emotion and power and hatred and all these things. How do you embody that in a creature, in a person? Could I kind of compact that down into an avatar and say, like, in a way, Sphere is like a living piece of chaos that's kind of stepped out of the warp and is just wreaking merry hell by killing people.
Yeah.
And and he's a weapon. He's a terrible, tragic character in his own way. That basically somebody who's been experimented on and had all this terrible stuff done to him by Horus and by Erebus, has kind of drawn all of these energies together and put this into one body and made this sort of perfect, imperfect weapon and said, right, now go out and do terrible things, and fight your way through get to the Emperor and destroy him. And so all of that was going through my head, is how do I create something that is a horrific character? And we start when you first see what Sphere does is you see the leftovers of these murders that he's committing, these horrible sort of things where it's this ritualistic sort of serial killer kind of stuff, and all of what he's doing is all sort of in praise of the chaos gods, strengthening himself. Every little thing he does, every murder that he commits, he's gaining energy from this, becoming more powerful, becoming more dangerous. So by the time we get to the end of the story, when Sphere is like fully revealed in the sort of bloom of his powers, it's this terrifying thing, and you're asking yourself, how could you possibly stop this thing? And of course, that's that leads you into the sort of climax of the story when he's as I say, at the absolute height of his sort of like horrific powers.
I do think as a character, he was incredibly memorable and iconic, I would say, throughout the Heresy series, because I'm kind of inured to the chaosy shenanigans going on, but this was really, really horrific. And the fear around watching, oh my God, he's fooling everyone around him. He can sneak into other people's bodies. He's never going to be detected. He's wholly evil. And he's being directed by bloody Erebus, the biggest bastard ever. And you see him growing in power. And I think he's one of the most scary things in the Heresy so far. The Heresy's not a picnic in the park. So I just thought I think I will remember Spear for a really long time for not the right reasons. And yeah, I get that with Alien, like you become so mega focused around this invincible creature that could just tear you to pieces. And not only that, but it can speak and be human and completely fool you. So, oh my gosh, love hate Spear. So
Well, that's great, because that's exactly what I wanted. I want you to be sort of terrified of it, but also compelled.
yeah, because
This is the sort of
yeah,
thing you can't play.
you're just thinking how, especially if he gets the blood, there's no way it will become invincible. But luckily, James, you had a fair hand and you sorted it all out. But crikey, Moses, yeah, it was really, really brilliant character. And I'm getting better at reading horror now. See, I appreciate it as I'm like, "Ugh," I'm like, it's really good. So yeah,
No, I'm happy. It's like if I made you feel slightly or even repulsed by a large amount, that's exactly
we're winning.
what I want. Sometimes
Okay,
people say to me, "Oh, God, I read this book and you wrote and I absolutely hated this character and I felt it really made me feel sick. How could you do this?" I'm like, no, that's what I want you to feel. I
no,
want you to go through that emotion because
there's
then you get closely with the characters.
there's such an art to it. I mean, you have to be so thoughtful around propelling the story, the character being at the center of it, being realistic and not to get found out by the other characters, but also mega powered and not kind of completely overpower the whole story and have it balanced with all these other characters. That on its own is worth the bloody New York bestseller list. I'll
Thank you.
I'll make it. I'll carve you an award from soap. But yeah, thank you for the invention of Spear. And maybe in another universe, Spear has like a whole like shelf of comic books about how gross he is. But as a one-shot enemy, I'm like Jeebus crackers. Like I'd be like, oh no, maybe I've made the best thing ever as like just this one book. But I've got experience of your book, James. You're not short of a few horrific characters, so we're all right there.
Well, it's illustrative of what the heresy is. Again, going back to what I said earlier on about how this is not a book about loads of space marines clashing with each other.
Mm,
Spear is chaos in the story, right? But
yeah,
he's all of chaos distilled down to one character because that's what this story is about. It's not. I'm not showing you the whole universe of the heresy. It's just this one little piece,
yeah,
just
yeah,
this one guy. But you have to distill all of that horror down into one character, and
yeah.
that was his function throughout the story.
I thought that was wonderful, especially the way you epitomize chaos through him. I think, I was trying to kind of draw an experience, and I remember in Dan's Eisenhorn, Eisenhorn kind of, put a demon in his body. I think it's Cherubial and kind of sucks him into his body. And that's already horrific enough. But the way Erebus kind of merges Spear with like chaos, it completely embodies it. I think that's the closest I've seen. I don't really want anyone to go any further. Any Black Library authors watching, just let's leave it here. Let's leave it with James. But not only did you create the iconic spear, you had to write about some real, big hitters. We had the Emperor make an appearance. We had Rogel Dawn show up. We had, of course, the horrible Erebus and Malkador. So iconic characters. How do you would you talk to like Graham and Dan about how they're characterizing and presenting them, or do you take from rule books, or how do you step into their shoes when you're popping them into the story?
Well, it's all of those things, so, yeah, definitely sort of like, again, going back to what have other people done, how they characterize these characters to try and make it feel consistent.
Yeah.
And then, like, what law documentation, what sort of rule book and kind of factual material is there about them? And then it's like, what does the story need these characters to do? And it's how do you line up all of those elements so
Yeah.
it feels sort of authentic, Writing Dawn, I mean, Dawn was fun to write because I feel like, he kind of gets an unfair shake. He's always seen as a bit of like the boring one.
Yeah, what? I don't get that. People are like, "Oh, he's boring." I mean, I think he's fine. I'm
I
glad
like,
that
I like
you
being at the
you're
sort of,
you're a hero for him. Good.
I like putting him in a sort of situation where he feels like he's kind of morally compromised. I mean, one of my favorite scenes is, I think it's where he's talking to, I forget the character's name now, the custodian, and he says Valdor, and he says, and he's talking about because he's in charge of building all of the siege defenses for the palace, and he's really upset about the fact that he's basically disfiguring this beautiful,
Yes.
and he's saying like, I've ruined all of this, and I'm going to do my duty, but I'm not happy about it. It's this wonderful piece of work that's been done here, and I'm bolting sort of metal plates and building,
Mm,
bricking it all up, and I'm just ruining the whole thing. And he
yeah.
really kind of genuinely feels bad about this. And it's, in a way, it's almost like, although he doesn't realize it, he's kind of seeing the future in a way, because that darkness, he's thinking, oh, when the heresy is done, we'll go back to the way it was. And of course, we all know that doesn't happen. And I really liked writing that moment because it shows him as somebody with a lot of hope
Yeah.
underneath. And I think that's not a note that gets played very often with the character of Dawn.
No, Dawn might have to become one of my favorites if you write him like that. God bless you, James. And as you know, I've admitted I'm an emperor botherer. So I absolutely loved when he came in. Can I read to you again?
So,
So the single utterance. So basically, you just hear this word enough, and it's in bold and in italics. So it's like when Death turns up in Terry Pratchett,
yeah.
like he's here, he's here. The single utterance was a lightning bolt captured in a crystal, shattering everything around it, silencing them all with an unstoppable, immeasurable force of will. And everybody kneels down. And then the question escaped Dawn's lips, Father? And I just melt, anytime they're like, Dad, you're here. I'm like, oh my God, all the feelings come up. Um, Now from the black came light. A figure stood there, effortlessly dominating the space, his patrician features marred by a mixture of turbulent emotions that gave even the mighty imperial fist a second's pause. The Emperor of mankind wore no armour, no finery or dress uniform, only a simple surplice of grey cloth threaded with subtle lines of purple and gold silk. And yet he was still magnificent to behold. Perhaps he'd been listening to them all along. Yet it seemed to be a defiance of the laws of nature that a being so majestic, so lit with power, could stand in a room amongst men, Astartes, and the greatest mortal psyker who ever lived, and be as a ghost. But then he was the emperor, and to all questions, that was the sufficient answer. And then he kind of strides through and pulls down all the curtains and goes, "We're not skullduggery people." But this really didn't help with my romance with the emperor. I mean, I love him so much. I don't know what's wrong with me. What's that like, writing about the emperor of mankind? How
That
do
was
you feel about him? Where is your heart when it comes to the emperor?
I really like doing that scene because that kind of, yeah, where he walks in and he's like, this is not what we're about. We don't
Yes.
do this, and he he has such, he's got at that moment, he's right high in his dander, he's up on his high horse, he's like, he's got his moral standpoint, he's like, we don't do this, we don't do the assassin thing,
Yeah.
even though they do, you know so but the emperor can, I mean, I think there's a scene earlier on where they're talking about the assassins and they say, we do this stuff and we don't tell him about it, so he can,
Yeah.
right? So he's got plausible deniability, right? So
Yeah.
he never has to sully himself with this stuff. We do the dirty work and we don't tell him about it. And I think it's Dawn says, like, he's the emperor, of course he knows you're doing it.
Hmm.
He knows everything. You can't hide it from him. So the fact that he does know, but he just pretends he doesn't know, there's a whole level of kind of, well, that's kind of a little bit hypocritical. Is you either do it or you don't do it. But
Yeah.
then, he's complicated that way. But yeah, writing him, I mean, one of the decisions we made very early on is that we would never write from his internal point of view. So,
Oh, so we're never going to get an Emperor's Diary. Bloody Magnus turned up today. Nothing
so
like that.
you're never gonna get a story where it's from it. We have the point. We usually have like a third person point of view, or you'll have a point of view from a particular character's viewpoint.
Mm,
We'll never get the Emperor's viewpoint because he's such an amazing sort of semi-divine being. He's
yeah,
unknowable. And if we got inside his head and we showed you his thought process, that magicness of him would go away.
yeah,
So we decided you will never ever see it from that. So you always see how other people are reacting to him, which is why, different characters will perceive him in different ways. Some people will see him, as this sort of like armored godlike being. Other times see it as like a wise old Obi-Wan Kenobi type figure.
mm,
Depends on whoever you are affects the way that you see him. So in that particular scene, he comes striding into the room as this. In a way, he's like a humble figure, but he's also a powerful figure because
mm,
he can embody that sort of duality. So that's the thing that has to be bared in mind every time you write that character is he is beyond human,
mm.
but at the same time he has to be written in a way that human people can connect with him.
Yeah,
So everything about the Space Marines and it's with the Space Marines and the Primarchs and then the Emperor, if you think of the ascending levels, is that they all have human qualities and human failings, and all of those things are magnified as you go up the chart.
yeah,
So good and bad. So the best of being a human is there in the Emperor, but also the worst of it as well. But it's magnified because he's this divine mythological character. The
yeah.
dial's turned up to 11, with him.
I mean, this is like apropos of nothing, but I always feel for him. I mean, clearly he's written so I can fall in love with him. Story of my dating life, red flag man. But
Yeah, pretty much.
yeah, but I feel he must be so lonely.
Oh
Like,
yeah. I mean, but the same, I mean, the Emperor, the thing I always say, the Horus Heresy comes down to the fact that really you can boil it down to the fact that a son didn't really know how to talk to a father didn't really know how to talk to his sons.
hmm,
That's kind of the problem at the core of the heresy, is if he was just a bit better at communicating,
hmm,
heresy probably wouldn't have shaken out the way that it does.
no. And
That's
I,
what it comes down to. Is he was, but you can see he's keeping stuff from his sons because he believes he's protecting them and he believes he's doing the right thing. But if he'd just been more open about things, chaos wouldn't have managed to get a foothold and the whole heresy wouldn't have happened. And that's the great tragedy of it, because
hmm,
that's a very human failing. And
yeah,
that's why I like him as a character, because, even though he is this huge mythological character, we can see our own failings and our own aspirations reflected in him. And that's why he's fun to write and fun to read.
yeah. And I think those elements of like frustration around communication, distancing people, not disclosing stuff, that may be sometimes why I feel that there's so much emotion at so many levels in this book, because you have the Emperor and there's that emotion around that disconnect. And then, there's the people who just want a quiet life on the planet and everyone thinks they're doing the right thing. We're just trying to save the universe on our own terms. We're just trying to live on our own terms. And I think that's why they make me quite emotional. So I go through scared, relieved, always a bit emotional and ennui. So God bless you, James, and thank you so much for this beautiful book and for talking to me about it.
It's my pleasure. I'm really pleased you've enjoyed it. I mean, it was an interesting thing for me to write because, like I say, it was very different from the other books, and it's been, here we are, like, 10 years, over 10 years now since I wrote it,
Yeah,
with it sort of back in my rearview mirror, and I still find that it is a divisive book among the readership. It's very much my Marmite heresy novel. It's, some people really really hated it. Some
yeah,
people, I didn't enjoy it because it's not a Space Marine novel, because some people come to the Horus Heresy because that's exactly what they want, and
yeah,
the book is not that. This is a very different book, And then I've had other people who say to me that's exactly why they love it, because it is so different, because it is a step away from what the rest of the books do. And I'm happy about that. I'm quite pleased that I can stir up that kind of level of emotion in people, even positive or negative, because the worst thing is if I wrote something and people were like, meh,
Oh my God. Yeah. The soft kiss of death, the meh.
yeah, it's just like, oh, I guess it was okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad I didn't have that response. If I get people say to me, oh, I loved it, oh, I hated it, like, well, at least I stirred something in you as a
Yeah.
reader. That's the
I,
important.
I think as somebody who is lucky enough to talk to the authors, I think that the books that I get to read, there is so much depth, and I certainly think this book's awesome. I did struggle because your brain is bigger and quicker than mine, but that's okay. I can't always be as quick as you. Um, but I think, and this, I'm getting a bit philosophical, but I think what I've learned from coming into this fandom is that a huge part of being part of Warhammer, whether you're gaming, whether you're playing across the table or a computer game, or you're reading the books, you have to stand in division. There is no, I'm dipping my toe in. It's all about this is great or this is bad. They're good, they're bad. It was his fault, it wasn't his fault. I feel like the whole franchise is built about this dissonance.
Oh,
So there's no way everyone is going to like every heresy novel. And even for example, if someone writes about salamanders or dark angels, people who don't like those are like, well, that's a bad book because my favorite are not them. And it's just like, but you and I know, James, on a spiritual level, I'm picking up so much more than just a book about Warhammer. When I read these books, I'm seeing a bit of your soul and your craftsmanship and what you want us to think and all these breadcrumbs you're putting. And I think that's the beauty of it. It's not only a book about a hobby we enjoy. There's some real skill and passion and craftsmanship, and so much you can enjoy if you let yourself be open to like the lungs being ripped and the dress. So
well,
yeah,
what we're doing here with these books is we're telling. I always think of the heresy and the Warhammer writers is we're inheritors of the grand tradition of pulp fiction storytelling, which has been around for decades. And what our job is to take you away from your ordinary life, take you to somewhere amazing, and thrill you, terrify you, to take you to these emotional highs and lows, and just to give you a fun, exciting roller coaster theme park experience. And then at the end of the day, you can put the book down and move on. And hopefully, underneath all of that, as well as the sort of the fun emotional energy, maybe we could do a little clever bit here and there. We could introduce some ideas and make you think a little bit about the world that you live in, about the attitudes to the people around you. We can make you question ideas that you might have held, make you ask questions about the world that you're in, and just subtly drop that stuff in there and make you think a little bit about it. And so that at the end of the day, when you finish reading the story, you take a little something away with you, and in a way it stays with you. And that's always the hope, I think, of every writer, is to just emotionally connect with our audience and give them an experience that they enjoy, but also say, here's a little something for you to bear in mind as you go on through your life. Have a think about what questions that book raises with you and how that affects you as a person.
well, I certainly think you've achieved that. I mean, this book's bloody chock full of that. Don't there's so, I mean, I think we could have gone through chapter by chapter and as in depth, even hearing how the title plays in with the Greek mythology and the literary. So thank you so much, James Swallow, for being on here to talk to me about Nemesis. I hope you'll come back again. And
Thank you very much for having me on. It's always a pleasure. It's always great to kind of get into the weeds and talk about all the tiny little minutiae of these books. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Hey, yeah.
James Swallow reports all his nemesis thoughts.